Now, the other side are moving in to give their explanations, picking up on pieces without any sort of credit to the earlier analysis that's gone before it. Now, let me give you a little bit of evidence about what's going on. 4 pieces of evidence that I think support very strongly the destruction of shared prosperity hypothesis, in the US at least. Figure number 3 here shows productivity and average hourly real wage and compensation of non-supervisory workers. These are non-managerial workers who represent about 80% of the workforce. The sample period is 1947 to 2009. The yellow line is an index of productivity. Starting at 100, it keeps rising throughout the period, though it is true the rate of growth of productivity slows down in parts of that period. The blue line is average hourly compensation. That's wages plus benefits. It's very important. You want to put in health insurance costs, pension benefits, all of that. And the red line is the average hourly wage. Now, what's significant about this diagram is that you see the first 25 to 30 years, from 1945 to 1975, all the series are roughly growing together. That's that phenomena of wages being tied to productivity growth. After 1975, they start to separate. Wages and compensation flatline, productivity keeps going, and that's that piece I talked about, breaking the link between wages and productivity growth. Figure number 4 shows the labor share of the US non-farm business GDP from 1945 to 2011. Non-farm business GDP means we're keeping out the agricultural sector and we're keeping out the government sector. And what we see is that this labor share of income behaves cyclically through to 1980, but then after 1980, a massive downward trend sets in. And the trend is actually accelerated. The collapse begins with Ronald Reagan, or actually it sort of begins just before, in the late 1970s, with Jimmy Carter, Paul Volcker taking over at the Fed. This is when much of the neoliberal macroeconomic paradigm becomes embedded. And Ronald Reagan sort of gives the green flag, as it were, the official endorsement. But in some ways, the debate has already been lost in the Democratic Party before 1980. And what's important here is the collapse has continued. At the look to the very end, after 2009, the darker shaded areas are regions of recession. After 2009, the collapse in labor share has actually accelerated. Mm-hmm. So that's again this problem of stagnation setting in. And then here's the other side of this diagram, which shows the labor share and corporate profit share. And again, you see this parallel between up from 1970, the sample period is shorter, from 1970 to roughly, to 1980, the labor share starts to decline, and then after 1980, the profit share, as the labor share declines, the profit share, obviously being 1 minus, starts to increase. And you've got this massive, enormous shift to profits that is really, since 2010, that's been sort of the worst feature of this recovery, which is again part of the story, if you were a Kaleckian, for stagnation. And finally, no, that's not finally. There's another figure that I have in there. This is the Piketty and Seiss work, focusing particularly on the U.S. pre-tax income share of the top 1%. I mean, what's interesting about this is that it's sort of a metaphor for what's been going on. You start in 1928, the pre-tax profit share of the 1% just before the Great Depression, the Wall Street crash in 1929, hits a maximum, I think it's at 23 or something percent. Then with the Depression, the profit share falls. Sorry, not the profit share. The pre-tax income share of the top 1% falls. This is the beginning of the New Deal reforms, Franklin Roosevelt's labor reforms, the regulation, etc. And the share keeps falling after World War II and actually bottoms out in the early 1970s. Then the thing turns upwards, starts to turn upwards in the late 1970s as the neoliberal paradigm begins to gain traction. And it's ironic that the pre-tax income share of the 1% got back to its 1929 levels in the year of, well, the year before the financial crisis of 2008. There's sort of a historical irony that it should be so close a pattern to resemble what happened before the Great Depression. And this, I think, is the figure that shows the role of domestic debt and its connection to what's been going on. The role of finance comes out very clearly. The bottom line is, the sample is divided in 1980. And the red line at the bottom is total debt in the economy. I think it excludes non-financial debt. Excludes financial debt. Before 1980 can be called the stable debt era. There's a slight growth in total debt relative to GDP, but it's pretty flat. After 1980, total debt as a percent of GDP explodes from roughly 150%, peaking at around 350%. Now notice what happens. The green line and the black line. The green line is actual GDP growth. The black line, the straight line, is the trend of GDP growth in the two periods. What you see is that the neoliberal period does not accelerate growth at all. Actually, growth is actually slower. And that means that really debt doesn't increase growth. What debt is doing is filling in for the demand gap that is emerging over this period. Okay, so what about the role of income distribution? A lot of people have talked about the role of income distribution. In my view, the role of income distribution is actually not that well understood. And I think some of our colleagues sometimes get it wrong, at least from my point of view. Deteriorated income distribution did not trigger the crisis. That's a mistake I think people sometimes make, that the crisis happened because of deteriorated income distribution. The effects of deteriorated income distribution were actually covered over by the long credit bubble and housing borrowing. Demand was replaced by borrowing. The trigger for the crisis was the implosion of the credit bubble, of which the house price bubble was part of. Income distribution becomes a critical factor after the crisis, because now borrowing is no longer possible to fill the demand gap. So in a way, income distribution is the dog that barks after the crisis and is the real problem of stagnation. And I think we need to sort of get that sort of cleared up. That's why income distribution is so important now as a macroeconomic functional issue rather than an ethical or even a political issue. And again, that's part of what's missing, I think, even as the other side tries to occupy this space. They can't quite bring themselves to talk about income distribution in that way. Okay, what about responding to the crisis? The three different explanations highlight what is at stake and why, something I'm going to talk about at the end, why ideas matter. Each explanation brings its own policy recommendations, and the explanation that wins out will therefore influence what we do. If you're a believer in the government failure hypothesis, then your recommended policy responses as follows. First, you actually double down on the deregulation of financial markets. The problem is too much regulation, not too little regulation. Second, you deepen central bank independence, and you deepen the commitment to low inflation targeting, and you impose strict rules about monetary policy, because you don't want to repeat the mistake that John Taylor accuses the Federal Reserve of doing, of keeping interest rates too low for too long by not listening to his Taylor rule. So you double down on this policy recommendation. And you also further shrink government, because government regulation and government intervention in the housing market is part of the problem. And of course, you also need to impose fiscal austerity to deal with the increased government debt that has been produced by the crisis. Of course, I think that if this actually wins out, and it's come close to winning out in Europe, then you do get the second Great Depression. In the US, it seems that we are more pragmatic, even though we can't get the explanation and articulation of the reasons why we do things right. We do in a sort of, we have a sort of what I call plutocratic Keynesianism. It does manage to stabilize the economy, but on behalf of the plutocrats rather than on behalf of working families. Now, if you're a proponent of market failure hypothesis, the response is different. In this case, you tighten financial regulation, because too much deregulation and self-regulation were part of the problem. And you use monetary and fiscal policy to fight the recession, but once the recession is over, you continue with the paradigm. They didn't see anything rotten with the paradigm. They got the regulation piece of it wrong. That's their view. And everything else about it was right. Think of that neoliberal policy box. There's nothing that they're unhappy about except that they got the regulation of financial markets wrong. So they continue to support corporate globalization. And guess what? We have something called the TPP, which Robert is an expert in. People want a transatlantic trade agreement, and they're more of the same. In fact, the trade agreements are more neoliberal than ever. Since there's no longer much in the way of tariff barriers to come down, you want to go for intellectual property rights, you want to go for investor protections, and you want to make sure that the government sector becomes fully tradable as well. And you continue with low inflation targeting, which we're still there, the Federal Reserve is still there. And you actually go for fiscal austerity to recover your fiscal position, which has been slightly compromised, supposedly, by the Great Recession. And we did that. In 2010, the US turned to fiscal austerity. The Republicans wanted it more than the Democrats, but it's not as if the Democrats were so hard on the idea, and it was, in fact, their idea all along, cooked up by Robert Rubin and Larry Summers in the 1990s. And, in fact, this is where the Obama administration was for much of the past 5 years. And it's not clear how departed it is from there. The rhetoric has changed, but it's not clear the political energy that would really want to make deep change is being invested. My view is that if we stay this course, this policy mix that the market failure people are putting together, then we end up with stagnation, which is what we have. So I think I've been doing pretty well. These are arguments that I made 5 years ago. I think it's absolutely, they've been borne out. We'll stumble along with repeated need for new interventions as the effects of prior interventions wear off. And that's been the course of the last 5 years. And here there's a political danger that we have to think politically now. I think this came up in the conversation yesterday about Europe. We're into the terrain of true political economy. To understand the economy now, we're going to have to understand politics as well. And in the US, the political danger is that political support for expansionary fiscal policy, which is a needed ingredient, runs out. And the policy then drifts into austerity, and then with that drift into austerity come the associated dangers of something deeper than just a stagnation. Now, for proponents of the destruction of shared prosperity hypothesis, the policy response is fundamentally different. We need to overthrow the neoliberal paradigm and replace it with what I call a structural Keynesian paradigm. Policy needs to repack the neoliberal policy box. You want to take workers out of the box, and you want to put corporations and financial markets in the box. Then you replace corporate globalization with managed globalization. That's a talk unto itself. You restore the commitment to full employment. That's what the debates about what the Federal Reserve should be doing, the relevant significance of inflation versus full employment, what constitutes full employment, again, a talk unto itself. You replace the anti-government, small government, anti-government, small government agenda with a social democratic agenda, and you replace the neoliberal labor market flexibility agenda with a solidarity-based labor markets agenda. And I think that this, in a nutshell, if we put this type of policy architecture in place, each of them needs to be fleshed out, and I've done that in other locations, not time to do it here today, this can move the economy back to shared prosperity. This type of paradigm is also applicable in all countries. If you think that this is these are global paradigms, then countries will have to develop, taking account of their own specific conditions, this type of framework, trying to put the corporations, financial markets, and the plutocrats back in the box. Now, of course, in addition to this is the structural piece of of change, we need to sustain demand during the transition process to prevent falling back. And again, I do like here something that you should think of this as needing to maintain what I call transition velocity. It's better than, Larry Summers talks of escape velocity. I think it's transition velocity. How do we move from one system to another? And this is incredibly challenging politically because the shared prosperity paradigm, program, involves a transition between systems, and we know that is always very bumpy. It's just not possible to transition between systems without quite a lot of economic turbulence and political turbulence, and that's part of the challenge. And so it means that even if we were to win one election on a program like this, we would be politically vulnerable throughout the transition period. So people need to think about the politics that go along with that. Now, there's a huge difference between the three views. I've outlined these three different views on the crisis, how to explain it, and what they imply. The government failure and the market failure hypotheses see the financial crisis as a unique one-off event, what might be called a black swan. It produced a very deep recession requiring extraordinary monetary and fiscal stimulus. But in their view, if you do that, the economy should be able to get back to the way it was before. They do not have a structural critique. Something went wrong in financial markets, deep recession, let's deal with those specific problems and we can go back to the way it was. The destruction of shared prosperity hypothesis sees things very differently. The financial crisis and the Great Recession represent the surfacing of the economic contradictions that are in the neoliberal model. And that is why the prospect is one of secular stagnation or unstable stagnation. Now you can try and blow air back into the model. And that's what the Federal Reserve is doing. As hard as it can to blow air back into the financial sector of the economy and hope that that will get things going again. And you may even succeed for a short while. This is again part of the problem of telling the story. We're in a moment right now where things look a bit better than they did. But it's always going to be fragile, and it's always going to feel uneasy. And guess what? Even as we've had a month or two of good news, we get some bad news on the housing sector, and we've got some bad news on auto sales from Ford today. Those are very important indicators in trying to understand what's going on in this economy. And that is because the contradictions are no longer in the background. The contradictions are in the foreground, and they're actually at the center stage. So where do we stand now? First, the global financial system has been stabilized, and even in Europe it's now been stabilized. But there are always signs of emerging turbulence elsewhere. And we saw that the emerging market economies had some turbulence at the beginning of the year, and there's still pockets of turbulence. Of course, we get geopolitical turbulence through the Russia-Ukraine stuff, could have an impact on all emerging market economies. So constant hiccups of financial turbulence, even though the overall system has been stabilized. The US economy has had moderately good news flow, at least through most of 2013. That slowed down a bit in the last 3 months regarding employment, but it's back up again. It's now back, it seems, to creating 200,000 jobs per month, and that looks like it will continue. That good news is prompting the Federal Reserve to cut back on its quantitative easing program, and it's also signaled it has no intention of raising rates right now. That's all good news. But where the mainstream is wrong is the belief that we have turned the corner and we're on the way back to good times. That belief is fundamentally wrong. The news is good now, but economies always generate sequences of better and worse news. And here what I say why I think they're dead wrong. Well, look, take a look at the Federal Reserve's forecasts over the last 5 years. They have been consistently prone to over-optimism. After the recovery, there was talk of V-shaped recovery. That's Ben Bernanke's famous expression of optimism in March 2009 when he referred to green shoots of recovery. Of course, the reality is every time the forecasters make an optimistic forecast, 6 months later they have to revise downwards their forecasts. And that explains why the Federal Reserve has had to repeatedly take on new emergency measures. QE1 in November 2008, QE2 in November 2010, QE3 in September 2012. The forecasters are wrong and over-optimistic. Why? because they believe in the market failure hypothesis. The Federal Reserve really bought into it, Geithner and the Treasury bought into it, and they're wrong. And on top of that, they have engaged in financial market regulation, which was needed. But paradoxically, or not paradoxically, it's not a paradox, ironically, when you have financial market reform, you actually tighten the screw on financial markets, and in a way you make it harder to recreate the very conditions that they're trying to blow air back into. They need to do it, but now it makes it even harder to have a bubble economy. And the last thing I'd say, I think the fact that they're always revising their forecasts in one direction, if you have a good model, sometimes you revise down, sometimes you revise up. That's what statistical error is all about. But for the last 5 years, all their forecasts have been too optimistic, telling me that there's something fundamentally wrong with their theoretical framework. So, let me turn now to getting near the end. How am I doing for time?
10 more minutes.
Perfect. In my view, the medium-term outlook is one of stagnation. And that's because policymakers have not repaired the fundamental problems. Problem number one is we still have the demand gap caused by deteriorated income distribution. In fact, those slides that I showed you showed the problem has gotten worse since the recovery. Problem number two is we have not fixed, in the US at least, the import and investment leakages associated with globalization. Problem number three is fiscal stimulus has turned to fiscal austerity. Problem number four is that the credit bubble means that we can no longer rely on finance to fill the demand gap, and financial reform, as I just mentioned, has tightened credit conditions. We have had a housing recovery, which has been very important in 2013, but in my view, actually I'm looking at these notes were written a while ago, and it's about to stall. It will stall because of higher interest rates, and it will stall because of higher prices. The very thing that they're trying to bring about brings about the phenomena of stalling when you have these real conditions in the economy. And guess what? April's numbers on new home price sales were very disappointing. I mean, worse than disappointing. They were bad. So, quantitative easing is an attempt to blow air back into the bubble. It stabilized financial markets. It's increased equity prices, but it cannot restart the easy credit merry-go-round of the past, and that, by the way, is why excess reserves have piled up in the banking system. If you want to understand what's going on, that's it. Can't get the thing going. The boom is not coming back, but here's my caution. Doesn't mean a financial crisis is around the corner. We've had our financial crisis. I think that will be sort of a much more, we might get big corrections of 20%. I don't think we're seeing another Lehman's in the US. Instead, what we are going to see is what is called the new normal, in which growth is slower, job creation is not fast enough to bring down the true unemployment rate. We've brought down the official unemployment rate, but there's massive hidden unemployment in the economy when you get the broader measures of unemployment that are also constructed. Now, mainstream economists will accept this. They will simply argue that the natural rate of growth has fallen and the natural rate of unemployment has increased. I think we're all familiar, we've seen those arguments. That's exactly what they always do in this situation. And I think the US elite will be okay with this unstable stagnation, because the new normal, so far at least, has implied much higher profits. The question politically is, will it be acceptable to ordinary people? Will it be just good enough for them, given their depressed expectations? Which is where I lean to. I think it will be just good enough for them because people have depressed expectations. Or alternatively, can progressives successfully challenge the legitimacy of this new normal? Can we show that there's nothing normal about it and there's nothing inevitable about it? And can we show that it is the result of policy choices, and if we made different policy choices, it could be different? And that brings me to the concluding part of my